I will reference the all the footage that the Pentagon has confirmed as being an actual physical object, such as those UFO tapes, UAP tapes taken off the coast of California. So people call it the Tic Tac, a UFO. And I point out that, look at that. There are infrared sensors from the jets and on board the ship, indicates there's no jets, no rockets, no source of heat. So even if there was a small, say, nuclear power plant on board, that certainly would have a big heat signature. So what is it? How is it moving straight up and down and against a very strong headwind at that altitude? How is it maneuvering? Well, I always point out, so strip away all the sort of jargon-laden and sensational alien stuff for a minute and just look at it objectively. It's an alternative energy and propulsion device, and it's ours. That is not an extraterrestrial vehicle. So one of the things that we have to educate the public on is that the good news is that the solutions we need to give ourselves an entirely new planet, like the ET that was with Colonel Corso, and when he said, "What's in it for me?" and the ET said, "A new world if you can take it, a new world if you." That was 1956. Now, here we are, whatever it is, 68, 67, whatever, 66 years later, and we're in a situation where we didn't take it. There were all kinds of covert interests that circled their wagons around Eisenhower and stopped this information from coming out. But even before then, in the era of J.P. Morgan and other big industrialists in the early 20th century, they had submarined the work of Nikola Tesla, because people need to understand he had not only Wardenclyffe, but he had other devices, including a car that ran with no need to plug it in, off the energy that it was pulling out from the environment. Now, Tesla referred to this as an infinite energy field. Years later, Professor Dirac called it the Dirac Sea. Other people have then quantified it with Professor Casimir in the 50s as the 0-point energy field. Other people refer to it as the quantum flux field. What is clear is that there is a huge abundance of energy in the space, embedded in the space around us. And I don't mean outer space, I mean the space where you're sitting. And the amount of energy density is estimated that the amount of space inside a coffee cup, that much volume, has enough potential energy to boil off all the oceans on the planet. It's an enormous amount of energy. So people have been experimenting with very high frequency, high voltage systems since the late 1800s. Some people think even the very earliest days of electromagnetism, and there was some unusual phenomenon. And this phenomenon resulted in an excess gain of energy and power out than they had to put in, which is, many people say, "Oh, it's violating the laws of thermodynamics." It is not. The second law of thermodynamics, which says that, it has to be, its energy is conserved and it has to, what's in and out. Because what's not being calculated is this energy field that is all around us, that has been quantified for over 60 years and almost 70, and scientifically established to exist. Now, what the mainstream science doesn't think is possible is that you could actually utilize that energy, that yes, it exists, but we don't know how to tap it. Well, that's not true, because the people who have made inventions over the last 100 years, who have, in many cases, stumbled across this. I always point out, empiricism is the mother of science, meaning direct observation. So many of the biggest breakthroughs in history scientifically have been almost like chance observation when somebody's fiddling with something, or even an accident that happens. That's true in medicine. It's true in physics and engineering also. So I think that when you begin to look at the history of this, you begin to also then have to ask the question, where have they all gone? I estimate there have been several thousand, quote unquote, free energy devices. And I'm going to use that term, not meaning that it's coming out of nowhere, but it's coming from this very vast, virtually infinite field of energy around us. And that those devices have all met a dead end in terms of getting out to the public. Why? So what we're going to explore in this 2-hour presentation, and also document and prove in the movie, is that these technologies, excuse me, these technologies have existed, but there are very powerful and corrupt interests, both private and industrial and governmental, that collude with each other to be sure these technologies don't get out and upset the apple cart of the several $100 trillion oil, gas, coal, electric utility grid, nuclear power, solar, wind, plug-in electric cars. All these are obsolete. I mean, I know everyone thinks they're being very virtuous with their solar and what have you. And I have the largest, and I'll just in full disclosure, I have at my farm in Virginia, the largest legally allowed solar farm allowed in the state by law. Bigger than that, we'd have to be a commercial operator. And a few months ago in the winter, we had about a foot of very heavy wet snow, took down millions of trees in the area. We were without power for an entire week. So this system, it's a over $80,000 system, which, you know, I took from my retirement savings to put in because I, you know, was wanting to do something to help with this situation before we bring these technologies out. We have to do some bridge technologies, but everyone listening, listen very carefully. That system, which is the largest legally allowed system in the world, that costs that much money, would not heat the house for an hour. We could have water, and we could have lights, and we could have hot water and the refrigerator. That's it. Now, that is not the energy density just is not there. Meaning energy density, the amount of power for that size and expense just isn't going to run planet Earth with 8 billion people. And it's too little, too late. So all the solutions being proposed by the fossil fuel devotees who just say, let's drill more and burn more, that's destroying the biosphere and leaving half the world in poverty. And all the people who say, well, we have this solution, we just have to spend trillions on this, that's not going to work either, because they're not calculating the fact that most of the pollution happening on Earth is not in Europe and America. It's in the developing world and in China and India. And those countries cannot afford a $120,000 or $80,000 Tesla car or an $80,000 solar panels in their meadow. So I think that we have to have some compassion, not only for the Earth, but the people of the Earth that aren't as lucky to and fortunate to live in the rich countries like Europe and America and Japan. Because the other big problem that's stalking humanity, and the reason why we never get into a peaceful situation, is this sort of zero-sum game of wealth and commodities that everyone's fighting over. Look what's going on with the energy crisis now. Europe is looking at a cutoff of gas from Russia that's going to leave their homes and factories freezing this winter. Now, this is ridiculous when it's 100 years on that we haven't needed those fossil fuels at all. So this has become a huge crisis for humanity. And I think that this is why we want to do this urgently, so that the public understands that if we can create a mass movement to develop these sources and release them open source, meaning no patent, no intellectual property secrets, no secret sauce, it's released. Now, the very good news is that we know this is possible to create these systems because, you know, Pat, you and I were out in the desert at a place about a month ago. Right. And we saw out there in a little building out in the desert, a device that was about the size of a large shoebox. It had 4 magnesium alloy plates. The startup system was a tiny 3-volt battery, which you could take out after it's going. And it had been sitting there for 2 years, putting out 3 kilowatts of power continuously. And we moved it up to 5 kilowatts of power. And we documented it. You're going to see it in this film. Now, there are other devices also that we have had people visit and that we're working on. The big problem is the inventors and the investors in those systems have made every predictable mistake that will guarantee they never get to the public. And they have tried to patent them. They kept it secret. A couple of these devices have software attached to them that if you tried to figure out how it works, it would destroy it. Now, I call this sort of delusional inventor syndrome, where the inventors think somehow they're going to outfox the secret government programs and also be able to monetize it like you would a new software package. What they're not calculating is that they are a very small David up against a massive Goliath, a massive headwind that's going against them in the form of covert programs as well as corporate interests. And the corporate interests are actually nastier than the government ones, because those guys are up against something they don't realize is out there. So we're going to also expose how people's devices have been confiscated, and we're going to use documents to prove it. We're going to show a patent office national security letter that one of these inventors got. We're going to show the Department of Defense Pentagon letter that was to the FBI demanding that they turn over the seized secret papers of Nikola Tesla that they grabbed the day he died. We have that document. We're going to show the testimony and the history of a number of these devices and how some of these people have been assassinated and killed. Others have had large buyouts where a big corporate interest buys it, and then we call it black shelving, where you put it on a shelf and bury it, take it out of the possibility of the public having it. There's at least a dozen strategies that have been used over the last 100 years to be sure these technologies never see the light of day. And they've been effective. Otherwise, you and I would be running our cars on an electric motor that would have a tiny little battery and a device that runs an electric motor, and it would never have to be charged in. This is not some utopian fantasy. The Floyd Sweet device, for example, he had something the size of a cigarette pack that could attach to an electric motor generator for 300 horsepower engine in your car. And when he was moving with some folks at General Motors to get that out, he was killed. So I think people need to understand, as Einstein correctly is attributed to have said, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. Mm-hmm. So what we are doing is documenting how these technologies work in lay terms, how they've come and gone, what the tricks are, what the landmines are out there that everyone steps on and gets blown up by. But then we're going to show what the strategy is. What strategy would actually frustrate these petro-Nazis and fascists that are destroying the planet? It's simple, but difficult at the same time. A concept is actually quite simple. It's doing an aikido, where you flip their dark energy into disclosure and light. It's like the National Reconnaissance Office above their headquarters, and this is the office that runs all the secret satellites. It says, we own the night. And I tell people we need to own the light, and the light of disclosure. But to do it, you're going to have two things line up. Someone who can bring forward or fund a lab to create a preferably solid state device, which is what these are that we're going to be showing, that exist right now on the planet, right this minute as I'm speaking. And put them out there with all the plans, no holdback of intellectual property, and no patent. So it is open source, and anybody who is an engineer or a company that wants to reproduce it can do so and improve on it. Then that way, it will be a very rapid, you'll have generation 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 within a couple of years. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we have to do, however, is to do that widely. What do I mean? It means that we have to reach between 1 and 2 billion people. Why is that? Because if it's only known by a few thousand or a few 100,000 aficionados of new energy, free energy, and UFOs, that's not going to change the dynamic, and it's not going to protect it. So the only way to do it is to have a strategy. And that's why we're doing the lost century. Because if it can be as close to or better than Unacknowledged, which has had 760 million people see it, which has led to all the things going on in Washington right now, this could create a mass movement for people who are concerned about energy independence, the environment, world poverty, the future of our civilization on Earth. It could create the same kind of momentum that would lead to these technologies being disclosed open source. Now, you have to combine both the open sourcing release of it, meaning no holdback on information, with all the information disclosed, not partially, which many of these inventors will release everything but the secret sauce. And then when people go to make it, it doesn't work. And I've spoken to many of them like that, many. And it's done deliberately because they're trying to protect the monetization, the money that they see their device is worth. What they don't realize is that they would make 1,000 times more money if they had it massively disclosed and open source, because there are companies like GitHub, which is a software company, is a multi-billion-dollar company. The other thing that we're going to point out is that the task is so huge, Pat. We have right now on the road 1.5 billion, with a B, motor vehicles. But we have discovered there's a device that with 1% gasoline and 99% water will run every car in the world without it being retrofitted. It doesn't need the gasoline at all, except that the little bit of gas in it protects the spark plugs and some of the other components in the engine from rusting. So, but that's a transition that could happen immediately. And guess what the exhaust is? Oxygen and water vapor. And the water gets recycled back into the water that's needed. So this is a technology that we've also recently discovered. Unfortunately, it does have a patent on it that I'm sure is only a partial disclosure of it. So what I'm saying is that if we can create the knowledge in the public, so that then builds where we can then either create an energy research lab, which would be expensive, or have somebody come forward willing to cooperate with this strategy. And what I tell people who are concerned about that, if anyone's listening, in the first phase of this, we have to release it open source because it protects everybody working in the field, because it's no longer a secret. Academic institutions and other companies will reproduce it. In other words, it will be proven instead of being an urban myth, which is what we did with the Disclosure Project on the UFO issue. But on top of that, on phase 2, after you release it open source, phase 2 of it, this is when you get into developing specific products. So any one of these any one of these technologies, it could be applied to run a refrigerator, your house, a business, scaled up, scaled down, miniaturized. So your phone that always goes dead, and you have to find a place to plug it in, or your computer goes dead. Anything that is now running on a battery would have a very small miniaturized version of one of these solid state systems. You would never have to plug it in. So there are literally millions, and I'm not exaggerating, of applications. And those can all be, once you take a fundamental science, like a basic science like this, then those can, at the second phase and the third phase, those can be monetized. You could even create patents around it because it doesn't matter. The underlying physics and science is out. So I think people have to understand that there's a lot of thought that's gone behind this strategy. And it's also a lot of school of hard knocks. You know, I personally have lost over $1 million looking into these technologies and going down the path and trying to work with people who have these very poorly thought through business legal strategies, that where each time they step into the legal trap, the financial trap, the patent trap, And, even if they don't step into those, the devices get confiscated, their offices get bombed, they're killed, whatever it is. So I think that we have to find a way to do this, because it's literally saving the planet and humanity from a very rapidly approaching potential extinction level event, where the biosphere, the oceans are so damaged that it won't be recoverable. Now, we know that these other civilizations out in space, the extraterrestrial civilizations, are very concerned about this. Many people who've had contact, they hear consistently this message that's a very specific environmental message and warning. They warn about two big things: the weapons of mass destruction and thermonuclear weapons, and the rate of destruction of our biosphere, the air, the land, the species extinctions, the oceans, etc. So this is a consistent message that's been coming through for over 60 years, 70 years, that we can document. But they're not going to swoop down and invade the earth and fix it for us. The expectation is we're the children of Earth. This is our planet. And we need to, through our own volition and collective positive good action, change this. Because if an outside force swoops in and lands and does it, it's first of all going to be portrayed by the warmongers as an alien invasion. And secondly, it would be about as effective as us invading Afghanistan for 20 years and expecting us to dominate that culture, and then we leave and it's been transformed into a Jeffersonian democracy. Well, it hasn't been transformed. I mean, it's back to warlords and terrorists. So we're, a civilization and a culture has to learn these lessons on their own. The interstellar civilizations are just wanting to be in place in case we really do blow the system, or worse, escape out into space beyond our solar system using covert energy systems and technologies that could be a threat to other innocent planets, because the human situation is considered something very unstable, which it is if you look at it objectively. So the lost century and how to reclaim it. We have to document the lost century and the science and prove this is the case. But we then have to provide, how do you reclaim it? And I call this a time snap, where if we align properly with right action and with the right strategy, boom, 10, 20 years, we make up for 100 years. The earth, the air and the water clears up very quickly. The earth has the ability to heal herself, but we have to stop abusing the earth. And for that to happen, we're going to have to come up with an entirely new paradigm for energy, which is frankly decentralized. And one of the big issues here, and this gets to one of the core issues of the secrecy, it's not just the hundreds of trillions of dollars that are invested in the power grid and utilities and oil and gas and coal and nuclear, et cetera. It's also that if every village in Africa or Asia or Latin America or Iowa could have its own source of energy, it means that power, literally, energy power that runs your house, goes back to the people, but actual power, political and social power, devolves from these huge global elite corporate and governmental folks to the local level, because they derive a lot of their power through the macroeconomic system, the global system that requires that everyone be dependent on this these super tanker lines coming from the Middle East or other places, or pipelines, or what have you. Right. And it also would solve another big problem, and that's the fact that half the world's population doesn't even have indoor plumbing, and 3 billion, listen to this number, 3 billion people, according to The Economist, do not have any way to cook their food without cutting down old growth rainforests or shrubs in the desert. This is why we're losing so much of that. Most people think it's due to big lumber companies, timber It isn't. Most of it is due to the existence of small farmers and people trying to cook, trying to make charcoal. That's 3 billion people. But there's another problem, and that is the social injustice and the instability globally of having a system. And one of the things I've pointed out for 30 years, the current energy system requires half the world be in poverty. Let me repeat that. The system we have today of oil, gas, coal, nuclear, public utilities, transmission lines, gasoline cars, absolutely requires half the world to be in poverty. Why? If those 3 to 4 billion people who don't have electricity and air conditioning and cars and a way even to cook their food suddenly live the way you and I do, the price of a barrel of oil would be $1,000. It'd be $20, $30, $40, $50 a gallon or more at the pump. Even middle-class people in America could not fill up their vehicles. Why? Because there's only so much supply. And if we were to allow the demand to meet where it should be, so other people live decently, you think the price of gas and oil and your electric bill is high now, it'd go up orders of magnitude. So the system is actually very cruel that it requires the poverty of half the denizens, the citizens of Earth. So this is something we very much need to think about also from a human compassion point of view. Any way you look at it, it needs to be done. Now, what's the downside? There will be economic and employment displacement for those who work in those energy sectors, but that can be accounted for because it's not going to happen overnight. This is not like an app that you download in 10 seconds. This is a heavy industry, and it will take 15 to 20 years just to convert the 2.5 billion homes on the planet to this kind of system, the 1.5 billion motor vehicles. Think about the fact that at peak production, we create 100 million cars a year globally. If it at that pace of maximum production currently, it would take 15 years for them to be replaced all these gas and diesel trucks and cars. So it's going to be over a period of time. But from everything I'm hearing from folks in Homeland Security and intelligence folks, the word has gone up, the balloon's gone up, that we probably don't have 10 years before we reach a tipping point, environmentally, geophysical stability, and other problems. So we need to hurry up. People working on these technologies need to consider the big missing element they never think of. Everyone thinks if you have, like one group I knew had $100 million in an operational system, and they vanished. They're gone. This has happened over and over and over. So you had all the money in the world and all the best solid state technology. You could have something that would sit on your coffee table and run your house forever without any electric bill and no pollution. It's not going to get out if you have the wrong strategy to get it out. These are the people who run the planet. Yep. These are the people who have endless wealth. These are the people who are not afraid to kill people or set them up for false arrest, or flat out have a black bag operation go in and sabotage the lab or bomb it or seize it. So we have to be realistic about, got to get out of this Pollyanna mindset. I think it's this Pollyanna naivete that, well, I have a better mousetrap, the world's going to be the path to my door. In reality, Murder Incorporated is going to be the path to your door. And this is the thing that none of these inventors and engineers consider. So that is something we have to educate the engineering and scientific community. This is not like just discovering another drug or another software application or another. This is the fundamental system that runs the whole planet, is the petrodollar, oil, gas, coal, electric grid, all of that. It is the baseline of the entire modern civilization that will have to be replaced. But anyone making a challenge to those vested cartels and interests, you're walking into the mother of all buzzsaws, and you're going to get chopped to pieces if you don't do it right. And there is a way to do it. Now, this has taken me 32 years, frankly, through the school of hard knocks and observation and direct hands-on experience to make the statements I'm making here today. But the very good news is there are at least 4 of them that we have discovered in the last few months that we're going to feature in this documentary that are currently operational on the planet. And there are many others we'll show going back 100 years that have existed. And then finally, one of the most exciting things about this film, I think, and the presentation on October 25th, those of you who can be there by webinar will see this, or in person, is we want to be able to show what the world looks like 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. And we're actually investing in some motion graphics and illustrations that would show what does the city look like in the future? What does transportation look like? And what is the earth itself in terms of the purity of the air and water? What about places that are inhospitable? Well, you could have a very large dome or structure because the energy to heat and cool it and keep it at an optimal temperature would be free once you have the system in. And you could also get water from the air because you can dehumidify and get water. You can buy those now, but they take a lot of electricity. But if the electricity is coming from this infinite energy field, guess what? Even the desert shall bloom. It's like the saying in the Bible. And you could have a productive agriculture, organic, at the North Pole, in the Sahara Desert, or anywhere. Or in where it's winter, doesn't matter if it's winter. But if you can control the temperature over the area where you're doing productive growing of substances and plants and wheat and whatever it is. So that is a game changer for micro farming, where people could have in their area a robotically controlled, with the digital technologies we have now, place where the foodstuffs that are needed locally are grown locally, but at very, very low cost. Now let's look at manufacturing. Most of the energy that goes into everything you buy is the energy to dig it up out of the ground, ship it to a place to be manufactured, the processing of it, shipping the manufactured product. But if all this begins to be able to do like 3D printing, but where you could have manufacturing using these high-tech systems, so many things, instead of being made 10,000 miles away and then shipped over to Washington or California, it would be done locally. So there'd be a revolution in manufacturing, which would also give enormous numbers of jobs. So I estimate that for every job lost in the current energy sector, there'd be 10 to 20 high-tech new jobs. And so we could be compassionate about the people who are, work on oil rigs or work at the public utility or a linesman for your public utility. But again, all that's going to change over about a 15, 20-year period. That you don't snap your fingers and suddenly get rid of everything that exists that's running the entire planet. So there's time to phase that in. But because we've squandered this lost century, we don't have time to waste. We don't have another century. I will guarantee you that. We might have 20 years. And so we're now at the point where, and this is an inconvenient truth, I say that rather smiling, because back when Bill Clinton and Al Gore were president and vice president, one of the close friends of the vice president, Al Gore, who famously did that movie, An Inconvenient Truth, and presents himself as an avid environmentalist. I met with his science advisor, Dr. Kohlenberger, and put on a silver platter, literally the solution to the environmental problem, all this information, and patents and details about how a number of them work. Turned their back on it. Too dangerous. Too many powerful vested interests and lobbyists, and too many people funding the politicians who are in those sectors of the economy. And so, I really am quite aggravated with people who like describing the problem, but turn their back on the solution. I think the people of the United States, but around the world, need to hold their governments accountable and say, all right, we're now spending trillions of dollars on solutions that aren't going to work, whether it's cap and trade, solar, wind. With all the work we've done since the 70s when solar and wind, it's 12% of the electricity now, 12%. And that's in a rich country like America. You go to other countries, it's virtually infinitesimally zero. And let's not forget, the entire European Union and United States is only about 10% of the global population. So if you're looking at it globally, I mean, let's face it, the air and the water and the oceans are all one globe. It's not like just because there's a geopolitical boundary between Finland and Russia, that if something's going on in Russia into the air, it's not going to affect the rest of the world. I mean, we have to look, go look at the pictures of the Earth from space. There aren't any walls between these countries. So if other developing countries are slashing and burning rainforests, and there are hundreds of new coal-fired power plants being built in the developing world without scrubbers like we have in the United States and Europe, they're very dirty. And I think that the other thing that people don't realize is that the people who don't believe in global warming, fine, but 8.6 million people a year die from the particulate matter, the air pollution from oil and coal and gas. And that's 8.6 million per year. That is more people than died in the Holocaust and all of World War II every single year. Now, these are facts. You can look them up. And so to fix the problem, I liken this to a global Marshall Plan, where, after World War II, the Marshall Plan was where we rebuilt Europe. But it was just a little small part of Europe, which is a very small part of the world. And now we're talking the entire planet being retrofitted, renovated in their entire energy system. And this is why another point I make to these inventors is that the task is so huge that if you had hundreds of companies the size of Amazon or Apple or Google or Tesla Motors, it really would scarcely be enough because it's heavy industry. It's not just pressing, clacking. Everyone thinks we're making such progress because we can clack on our phones and do something. But the energy running this phone is coming from a coal-fired power plant over here, right? Like in the 1800s. So you can go back 130 years, 140 years, and you will see that whether it's the Mercedes making the first internal combustion engine for a car, and look at your car out here. It's fancier, it's more refined, it has computers on it, but the basic energy that's running the car hasn't changed since 1888. This is 2022. So we're talking way more than a century, almost 1.5 centuries. So I think that the other thing is that we have to be able to just say collectively as a people, the people who have been the industrialists and who were at the roots of industrial fascism in the late 1800s and early to mid 20th century, you've had 150 years to ruin the planet. Now it's time for the people to fix it. And we're not going to be intimidated. And in fact, we're going to be smart about it. Because now imagine if we have a laboratory with one of these devices being studied and everything about it's released in real time, blockchain or some system where it can't be taken down. And at each refinement, it just keeps getting released to the public massively. Well, the problem is, how do you make sure that it gets out massively? This is where another appeal I'm making today. If you or someone you know is a influencer or a social media, has a large number of followers or a celebrity, this is when we need them to step in. Why? Because the Washington Post, the New York Times, Fox News, CNN, the BBC, they will not cover this. Why? Because they are vertically and horizontally integrated into these financial interests. These technologies are real. The earth can be made new again, and humanity can go forward for thousands of years without pollution or poverty And I think within even my lifetime, and I'm 67, I think there's a very good chance we could see the world that was offered to Colonel Corso when the ET said, a new world if you can take it. I actually think this is 100% doable if we all pull together.